Mike Tyson was simply looking for a peaceful stroll through Brooklyn, but destiny had other plans. As a gang of massive, spike-covered bikers thundered down the street, it wasn't just the roar of their engines that caught his attention, it was the sight of them cornering a terrified kid. The bikers relied on their sheer size and intimidation to keep others at bay. What they didn't realize was that they had picked the wrong man to mess with. Mike Tyson wasn't about to stand by and let this happen. Brooklyn's streets pulsed with their usual energy, kids playing stickball, old-timers swapping stories on stoops, and the steady beat of hip-hop spilling from corner stores. Dressed in a simple hoodie and sneakers, Mike Tyson blended in like just another neighborhood guy. The heavyweight champion wasn't looking for trouble. His fists, known for their devastating power in the ring, remained calmly tucked in his pockets. But trouble had a way of finding Mike Tyson. As he turned onto a quieter street, the peace was shattered. The deep, guttural roar of engines reverberated off the brick buildings, like some mechanical beast awakening. Mike's eyes snapped toward the sound, and that's when he saw them. A gang of bikers, huge, unmistakably not the type who rode for leisure. Their bikes, beasts of chrome and black steel, rumbled like rolling thunder. But it wasn't just the machines that caught Mike's eye, it was the riders themselves. Clad in heavy leather, their jackets and gloves bristling with spikes and studs that glinted in the afternoon sun, they exuded menace. Thick, tattooed arms, veins bulging like steel cables, flexed as they gripped their handlebars. Their faces, obscured by dark sunglasses and cruel sneers, carried the unmistakable confidence of men used to instilling fear. But they hadn't seen Mike yet. Not until they pulled up beside the sidewalk and saw what Mike had already noticed, a kid, no more than 10 years old, standing frozen near a lamppost. The kid's backpack was halfway off his shoulder, and his eyes were wide with fear as one of the bikers revved his engine, sending a loud burst of exhaust into the air. Mike's jaw tightened. The lead biker cut his engine with a harsh twist of his wrist, the sudden silence feeling heavier than the roar that had come before it. The massive man swung his leg over the hulking metal beast of a bike, his spiked boots hitting the pavement with a thud that echoed down the street. The sound was almost theatrical, like he wanted the world to know that he was in control, that this was his stage now. His leather jacket gleamed under the afternoon sun, covered in jagged metal studs and patches from motorcycle clubs no one outside his circle dared to cross. His beard was thick and unruly, his face scarred from more fights than he probably remembered. But it was his eyes, hidden behind dark, reflective sunglasses, that told the real story. Cold. Calculated. Dangerous. He didn't say a word at first. He didn't need to. His mere presence screamed trouble. The biker's attention wasn't on the street, the bystanders, or even his own gang revving their engines in the background. It was on the kid, a boy no older than 10, standing frozen near a rusted lamppost. The kid clutched the straps of his backpack like it was the only thing anchoring him to the ground. His eyes were wide, pupils darting between the biker and the empty space behind him, like he was calculating whether he could make a run for it. But he couldn't. Not fast enough. The biker took a slow, deliberate step toward the boy, his heavy boots grinding against the pavement. His lips curled into a grin that had nothing to do with humor and everything to do with dominance. He reached out with one hand, a thick, gloved paw covered in metal spikes, like he was about to grab the kid's backpack, or maybe worse. And that's when Mike moved. Mike Tyson didn't rush. He didn't shout. He walked. Each step was steady, deliberate, and controlled, like a lion moving toward its prey, not out of fear, but with the confidence of someone who knew exactly how this would end. His hands were still in his hoodie pockets, his face calm, but there was an intensity in his eyes that could have melted steel. The street seemed to pause. The kids who'd been playing down the block stopped mid-game, their laughter fading into uneasy silence. The shopkeepers leaned out from behind their counters, their eyes widening as they recognized who was walking toward the biker gang. But Mike wasn't looking at them. His gaze was locked on the lead biker. And the biker finally noticed. The biker's grin faltered just a little as he turned his head toward Mike. It wasn't recognition, at least, not yet. It was confusion. Who was this guy, walking straight into the middle of something he had no business being part of? But that confusion didn't last long. It morphed into annoyance, then into aggression. "What you lookin' at, old man?" the biker barked, his voice rough and gravelly, like he'd spent years screaming over engines and bar fights. His tone was dismissive, but there was an undercurrent of tension, like he knew, deep down, that he'd just made a mistake. Mike didn't stop walking. He didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. "I'm lookin' at you," Mike said, his voice low and steady, carrying more weight in those 5 words than the biker's entire crew combined. The biker scoffed, but his movements betrayed him. His hand, still hovering near the kid's shoulder, twitched slightly, like he wasn't sure whether to grab the boy or deal with the man approaching him. He chose wrong. "You got a death wish or somethin'?" the biker snarled, stepping forward now, trying to use his size to intimidate. The sunlight caught the spikes on his jacket, making them glint like teeth in the daylight. The other bikers cut their engines, the sudden silence making every sound, every breath, every footstep, feel amplified. But Mike wasn't breathing hard. His footsteps didn't falter. He stopped just a few feet from the biker, his hands still in his pockets, his expression unreadable behind his hoodie's shadow. "I don't need to wish," Mike said quietly, almost like he was having a casual conversation. But the tension in his voice was anything but casual. The biker didn't like that. His face twisted into a sneer, and before anyone could process what was happening, he lunged. His spiked glove shot toward Mike's face, a punch that could have broken bones if it landed. But it didn't. Because Mike Tyson wasn't just any man standing on the street. From the corner of the block, someone gasped. A woman standing by the bodega entrance clapped her hands over her mouth. The other bikers leaned forward, anticipation gleaming in their eyes. They were used to watching their leader dominate, to seeing people cower or crumble under his fists. But as that spiked glove swung through the air, Mike didn't duck. He didn't step back. He moved forward. And in that moment, the crowd knew, this wasn't going to end the way the bikers thought it would. The biker's fist froze mid-air as Mike's hands finally left his pockets, his right hand shooting up with a speed that defied logic. The biker's arm barely had time to register the block before Mike's left fist connected with his jaw. The sound was sharp, immediate, a crack like lightning splitting the sky. The biker's sunglasses flew off his face, landing several feet away on the sidewalk. His body followed, crumpling to the ground in a heap of leather and metal. The entire street fell silent. For a moment, no one moved. The other bikers stood frozen, their mouths slightly open, their eyes darting between their fallen leader and the man who had dropped him with a single punch. The kid, still standing by the lamppost, stared wide-eyed at Mike, his grip on his backpack loosening just a little. Mike didn't look at the bikers. He didn't look at the crowd. He looked at the kid. "You good, kid?" he asked, his voice soft in a way that felt almost out of place in the aftermath of what had just happened. The boy nodded, his small voice barely a whisper. "Yeah." But Mike knew it wasn't over. Not yet. Because as the other bikers started to shake off their shock, as they realized their leader wasn't getting up anytime soon, their faces twisted from surprise to rage. One by one, they stepped forward, their hands clenching into fists, their chains rattling at their sides. The biggest one cracked his knuckles, his eyes locked on Mike with a look that promised violence. But Mike Tyson didn't flinch. He simply pulled his hoodie back, revealing his face fully now, his expression calm but deadly. And as the first biker lunged, Mike smiled. They were about to learn a lesson they'd never forget. For a moment, everything was still. The kind of stillness that feels heavy, pressing against your chest like the air itself is waiting to see who's going to blink first. Mike Tyson stood there, his fists loose at his sides, his body relaxed, but every muscle was coiled, like a spring ready to snap. Across from him, the remaining bikers formed a loose semicircle, their massive frames casting long shadows on the pavement. Their leader lay crumpled on the ground between them, his unconscious body a clear message: Mike wasn't to be messed with. But arrogance is a powerful thing. And these bikers? They weren't about to back down just because one of their own was lying flat on the concrete. The biggest of the remaining bikers, a hulking brute with arms the size of tree trunks and a spiked mohawk that made him look like something out of a post-apocalyptic nightmare, stepped forward. His leather jacket creaked with the weight of his movements, each stud and spike catching the fading sunlight, casting eerie reflections on the surrounding walls. "You think you're tough, old man," the biker growled, his voice low and gravelly, filled with a mix of disbelief and fury. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life." Mike didn't respond. He didn't need to. His eyes stayed locked on the biker, steady and calm, like he was sizing up an opponent in the ring. And that silence? It was more infuriating than any insult. The biker lunged. His massive fist, wrapped in a leather glove studded with metal, swung through the air with enough force to knock down a lesser man. But Mike wasn't a lesser man. He was a champion. In a blur of motion, Mike ducked under the punch, his movements smooth and effortless, like he'd seen it coming before the biker even threw it. He pivoted on his heel, coming up behind the brute in a split second. And then he struck. Mike's fist connected with the biker's kidney, a precise, devastating blow that sent the man stumbling forward with a grunt of pain. Before the biker could recover, Mike followed up with a sharp right hook to the side of his jaw. The crack echoed down the street, and the biker dropped like a sack of bricks, hitting the pavement hard. The other bikers froze for a split second, shock flashing across their faces. They hadn't expected this. They'd thought their size, their numbers, their intimidation would be enough. But Mike Tyson wasn't intimidated. And now, they knew it. The hesitation didn't last long. With a roar of anger, the rest of the gang surged forward, their heavy boots pounding against the pavement, chains swinging, fists clenched. But Mike was ready. One biker came at Mike from the left, swinging a chain like a whip. Mike dodged to the side, the chain whistling past his ear, and grabbed it mid-swing. With a quick, powerful yank, he pulled the biker off balance, sending him sprawling to the ground. Another charged from the right, aiming a punch straight for Mike's ribs. But Mike caught the man's wrist mid-punch, twisting it sharply and forcing the biker to his knees with a cry of pain. A swift knee to the face knocked him out cold. They kept coming. Two at once now, one swinging a crowbar, the other aiming for Mike's legs with a heavy steel pipe. Mike ducked under the crowbar, his body moving with the grace of a man who'd spent his life dodging blows, and delivered a brutal uppercut to the biker with the pipe. The man's head snapped back, and he crumpled to the ground. The crowbar came down again, but Mike stepped in close, too close for the weapon to be effective. He grabbed the biker's jacket, pulling him off balance, and slammed his head into the side of a nearby lamppost. The biker slid to the ground, unconscious before he hit the pavement. The fight was brutal, but it was clear who had the upper hand. Mike moved like a force of nature, his punches fast and precise, his movements efficient and devastating. The bikers, despite their size and numbers, couldn't keep up. The few who were still standing began to hesitate, their bravado fading as they realized they were facing a man who wasn't just strong, he was unstoppable. Mike's breathing was steady, his body still loose, even as the last biker standing took a shaky step forward. The man's hands were raised, but not in a fighting stance. It was surrender. The street was silent again, the only sound the groans of the bikers lying scattered across the pavement. The kid, still clutching his backpack, stared at Mike with wide eyes, a mixture of awe and disbelief on his face. Mike turned to him, his expression softening. "You all right, kid?" he asked, his voice calm and gentle, a stark contrast to the fury he'd just unleashed. The boy nodded slowly, his voice barely a whisper. "Yeah, thanks." Mike gave him a small nod, then turned back to the battered gang of bikers. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The message was clear. As Mike walked away, the kids still standing by the lamppost, the bikers lay where they'd fallen, their pride shattered alongside their bruised bodies. They'd thought they could scare the neighborhood into submission. But they hadn't counted on Mike Tyson. And now, they'd never forget him. The street felt like it was holding its breath. Every eye, whether from the crowd of bystanders gathering on the sidewalks or the kids frozen mid-play down the block, was glued to the scene unfolding in front of them. Mike Tyson stood perfectly still, his body relaxed, his eyes locked on the lead biker, who was now lunging forward with the confidence of a man who had never lost a fight in his life. The biker's spiked glove gleamed in the sunlight, his fist cutting through the air with enough force to knock out an average man cold. The sheer size of him, the raw aggression in his swing, would have sent most people scrambling. But not Mike. Mike's breathing was calm, his focus unshakable. He'd faced giants in the ring, men who hit like freight trains, but none of them had ever made him flinch. And this wasn't a ring. This was real. The biker's fist came within inches of Mike's face, but in that split second, Mike's body moved. Not with panic, not with hesitation, but with precision. His right hand shot up, deflecting the biker's punch just enough to throw off his balance. In the same fluid motion, Mike's left fist, his legendary left, lashed out. It was fast. Too fast. The punch connected with the biker's jaw with a sickening crack that echoed down the street like a gunshot. It wasn't just the force of the punch, it was the accuracy, the way it landed at the exact angle needed to shut down every muscle in the biker's body. His sunglasses flew off his face, landing several feet away with a soft clatter on the pavement. But the man himself? He dropped like a sack of bricks, collapsing in a heap at Mike's feet, his body limp before it even hit the ground. For a heartbeat, everything was silent. The other bikers froze. Their leader, the biggest, baddest guy among them, was unconscious, sprawled out on the sidewalk like a rag doll. They stared at Mike, their faces a mix of shock and disbelief, as if their brains couldn't quite process what had just happened. They'd rolled into this neighborhood thinking they owned it, thinking their size and their numbers were enough to intimidate anyone. But now they were facing something they didn't understand. And Mike? Mike just stood there, his fists lowered, his breathing steady, like he hadn't just dropped a man twice his size with a single punch. The hesitation didn't last long. One of the bikers, a man nearly as big as the leader, with a spiked mohawk and arms covered in tattoos, let out a roar of rage. He charged. And with that, the rest of the gang followed. It was like watching a pack of wolves descend on a lone lion. Chains swung through the air, fists clenched around crowbars and pipes. Their boots pounded against the pavement, their leather jackets bristling with metal spikes. But Mike didn't move. Not yet. The first biker lunged with a wild punch aimed at Mike's ribs. But Mike sidestepped effortlessly, his movements sharp and economical. He'd seen this before. He knew exactly how this would play out. He grabbed the biker's wrist mid-swing, twisted it sharply, and drove his fist into the man's stomach with enough force to lift him off the ground. The biker crumpled, gasping for air, before collapsing in a heap beside his unconscious leader. Another came at him with a chain, swinging it like a whip. Mike ducked under the swing, letting the chain whistle past his head. He stepped in close, grabbed the chain mid-air, and yanked it hard. The biker lost his balance, stumbling forward, and Mike greeted him with a brutal uppercut that sent him sprawling backward, out cold before he even hit the pavement. By now, the crowd on the sidewalk had grown. Neighbors leaned out of windows, people on the street had their phones out, recording every second of the fight. And what they saw wasn't just a man defending himself, it was a masterclass in controlled power. Mike Tyson moved with the precision of a man who had spent his life perfecting his craft. Every punch, every dodge, every counter was deliberate, efficient, devastating. The bikers were bigger. They had weapons. But none of that mattered. Mike was untouchable. The last biker standing, the one who'd been hanging back, hoping his friends would overwhelm Mike, now realized the mistake they'd made. Mike turned to him slowly, his expression calm but deadly. The biker's bravado faded, replaced by fear as he took a hesitant step backward. "You done?" Mike asked, his voice low but carrying across the street. The biker swallowed hard, his eyes darting to his fallen friends, then back to Mike. He nodded quickly, dropping the chain he'd been holding. Mike didn't say anything else. He didn't have to. The message was clear. The street was silent again, the only sounds the groans of the bikers lying scattered across the pavement and the distant hum of city life slowly returning. Mike turned to the kid, who was still standing by the lamppost, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and awe. "You good, kid?" Mike asked, his voice softer now, the edge of the fight gone. The boy nodded slowly, clutching his backpack tighter. "Yeah, thanks." Mike gave him a small nod, then turned and walked away, his steps as calm and steady as they had been when he first approached. Because Mike Tyson didn't need applause. He didn't need recognition. Sometimes, being the toughest guy in the room isn't about who you can beat, it's about standing up when it counts. And today, Mike Tyson stood taller than ever. The street was littered with defeated bikers, their hulking forms sprawled across the pavement like fallen dominoes. Mike Tyson stood in the middle of it all, his breathing steady, his fists finally unclenched. The crowd that had gathered was silent, processing the force of nature they had just witnessed. The kid, still pressed against the lamppost, stared at Mike with wide eyes, his fear replaced by something closer to awe. Mike turned to him, his expression softening. "You good, kid?" The boy nodded, gripping his backpack tightly. "Yeah, thanks." Mike gave him a nod, then turned and walked down the street, leaving the chaos behind him. The bikers wouldn't be getting up anytime soon, and even if they did, they'd never forget who they messed with that day. For Mike Tyson, it wasn't about proving he was the toughest guy on the block. He already knew that. It was about standing up when no one else would, about protecting someone who couldn't protect themselves. That's what strength really meant. The bikers had come into the neighborhood thinking they could intimidate and control through fear. But they learned the hard way that some people can't be bullied, no matter how big you are or how loud your engines roar. And Mike? He walked away not as a champion in the ring, but as a champion of the streets, a reminder that sometimes, the real fight isn't in the spotlight. It's in the moments when no one expects you to swing.